pretty amazing to see the army of guys in the kitchen trying to figure out how to make lunch for everybody. On your typical Sunday, there might be a couple women in there, mothers that are just much more gifted for that. So full disclosure, I wasn't here for Bible class. I was slicing stuff in the back. So if there is some repeat, I apologize, I wasn't here. But as I was meditating, just what to preach about for Mother's Day, just thinking about my own mother and growing up and what that was like, and thinking about how much time and effort she spent in teaching us simple things to complicated things. I mean, she homeschooled us, and so even that in of itself was a big task. And sometimes even when I knew it wasn't easy for her, yet she did it, and all the time and effort to raise us. There was 5 of us, to love God, to know how to behave ourselves. Everything from as simple as pushing your chair after and eat everything you put on your plate, all the way down to reading us Bible stories every day as part of devotions when we were at homeschooling. And I know she spent a lot of time in prayer for us, and we can just praise God for that. And the impact that a mother has on the lives of her children is really, really profound. A mother who loves and nurtures her children and trains them and raises them up really has a profound impact on the next generation. Those children will grow up to be leaders and wise people of this earth. And then she can have an impact on multiple generations as her children turn around and raise their children following the example that she set for them. And you can see this. And then on the opposite side, okay, we're saying mothers. Obviously, fathers are involved, and the parents work together, and both are accountable for this. But when they're not in the picture, and when they don't care for their children, or are too busy to spend time, oftentimes those children grow up or never really grow up and don't become productive citizens of society at a minimum. But really, a lot of a child's development can be chalked up to how he was raised by his mother. In the Bible, we have lots of examples of mothers. We have some very good ones, and we have some bad ones. But one of the ones that came to mind was one named Jochebed. If that's not familiar to you, think Moses and his mother. So I'm sure we know that story. But it was really interesting to think about who Moses is and what impact she had on him as his mother. So our text will be in Hebrews chapter 11 today. Hebrews chapter 11, we'll read a few verses. We'll start reading at verse 23. Hebrews 11, starting at verse 23, says, "By faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because they saw that he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandment. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured, as seeing him who is invisible. Through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. By faith they passed through the Red Sea, as by dry land, which the Egyptians, assaying to do, were drowned." So most of us probably know that Hebrews 11, you can call it the hall of fame of those of great faith throughout Scripture. They're a cloud of witnesses that testify to the faith of God, and that we can look on as those who've gone on before, and what their faith wrought and what God was able to do through them. So we know that Moses, I'm sure all of us know who Moses is. He was a great figure of the Old Testament. He delivered the law unto the people of Israel. He communed directly with God on the mount. Really, he had a nearness to God near unmatched, if unmatched, than anyone else in the Old Testament. He wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. I mean, the stuff that Moses did and what he is known for is profound. And he was a leader of leaders. And yet, the verses that he's given in this inscription in this Hall of Fame start by mentioning his parents, which I never really thought about that before, but when I realized, it really jumped out to me, like, they are mentioned here before even he is. So it says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hid 3 months of his parents, because they saw that he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandments. So what was that king's command? What was it that they were not afraid of? So if we go to Exodus chapter 1, starting in verse 15, we'll be doing some reading from Exodus, so if you want to turn there, it might be worth it. Just to give you just to understand what the situation was. So the Hebrews had been slaves in Egypt for about 400 years, and pharaohs had come and gone. We know the history of Joseph and how the Hebrews ended up there. And at some point, the Hebrews had multiplied to the point where they were nearing, if not exceeding, the population of the Egyptians inside their own land. So this new Pharaoh was super anxious, and he's like, what is this? And he was terrified that the Hebrews would be, maybe take over the country, or maybe join forces with an enemy that would maybe come to try to take over the country. So we read here in Exodus chapter 1, starting at verse 15, what his plan was. He comes up with this plan: we're going to do some population control on the Hebrews. It says, and the king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of which the names were Shiphrah, and the name of the other was Puah. And he said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then ye shall kill him. But if it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the men children alive. So first he goes to the midwives and those who are assisting in childbirth and tells them, you're going to kill all the males that are born. And the midwives, who were God-fearing women, didn't do that. So then, obviously, male children kept being born, and the king of Egypt, in verse 18, called the midwives and said unto them, why have you done this thing, and hath saved the men children alive? And the midwives said unto Pharaoh, because of the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are lively, and are delivered ere the midwives come in unto them. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and waxed very mighty. So he tried to stop it, and it wasn't working. It says, and Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, every son that is born ye shall cast into the river, and every daughter ye shall live. So then he decides to move past just the midwives. Apparently probably all of his officials, or his government, police, soldiers, whatever they were, commands them, you guys are responsible to make sure that there's no more men, children born to the Hebrews. So this was the king's commandment. This is the situation we find ourselves in when Moses was born. So if we keep reading now in chapter 2, we read about this account of how his parents hid him. In chapter 2 says, and there went a man of the house of Levi, and took a wife, a daughter of Levi. So her name was Jochebed. In other scriptures we find out. It says, and the woman conceived and bare a son, and when she saw that he was a goodly child, she hid him 3 months. So she didn't want him to be cast into the river, so she hid him as long as she could. She loved that little baby, and she hid him for as long as she could. She loved it. She cherished it. We can see that, obviously. But it's interesting. It's not like this was her first child. She already had 2 other ones, so it's not like this was her first child and it was super special. This was her 3rd child. Her other 2 children were Aaron, who had become the high priest of Israel, and Miriam, who was often mentioned as a leader among the women. So even her other children grew up to become leaders to the Hebrew people. So she loved that child enough to risk trying to keep it hidden from what was most likely soldiers or whatever going around and, under the king's commandment, find baby boys and kill them. So she was risking her own life, because who knows what would happen to her if they found out that she had disobeyed the king. Especially the Hebrews, they were slaves, so they had zero rights. As Americans, we have all of our rights. There was no rights for the Hebrew people living in Egypt. So after that, so in verse 3 it says, "And when she could no longer hide him, she took for him an ark of bulrushes and daubed it with slime and with pitch, and she put the child therein. And she laid it in the flags by the river's brink." I mean, this is just incredible. I don't really know what she was thinking. It's a pretty fantastic solution. Maybe she knew that she was going to put it near the royal bathing area or she had some plan. But I think what it really points to is the incredible lengths a mother who loves her children will go to try to do what she thinks is best for them, to try to protect them from evil, to try to save them. She will do anything if she thinks it's got the slightest chance of helping that child survive. Obviously, whatever the situation was, there was no chance in her arms. She couldn't hide him anymore. So whatever those pressures were, she thought that this would be even better. But I think it also points to her great faith. It says, by faith they hid Moses. And so I believe that by putting this baby in this basket and putting it in the river, she was totally surrendering this child to God. And she had faith that God would watch over that little one. And when she couldn't do anything else, the only thing left was to just give that baby over to her God, who she knew had watched over his people till now, and she believed would watch over him in the future. It says that his sister stood afar off to wit what would be done to him. So his sister was watching the basket, and the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river. And her maidens walked along by the riverside, and when she saw the ark among the flags, she sent her maid to fetch it. It's amazing how God works, and by the providence of God, of all the people that could show up, shows up the daughter of Pharaoh. The way I understand it, this Pharaoh, he didn't have any sons, and it sounds like his daughter didn't have any either. From what I could gather, it's pretty hard to, history is kind of muddy when you go that far back, but it seems like this was the case. And so this daughter didn't have any children of her own, and she needed a son who would be heir to the throne. And when she had opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the babe wept. And she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." In her mind, she probably thought the gods, lowercase g, had sent her this baby that she wanted. But we know that it was God who was working and through the faith of the real mother. It says, "Then said his sister to Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and call thee a nurse of the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for thee?' And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Go.' And the maid went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said unto her, 'Take this child away, and nurse it for me, and I will give thee thy wages.' And the woman took the child and nursed it. And the child grew, and she brought him unto Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she called his name Moses, and she said, 'Because I drew him out of the water.'" It's amazing how God brings this child back to the mother that had loved it so dearly, that was going to risk anything to try to save it. And nothing is better for a baby than to be nursed by its own mother. And God saw through his providence that this would happen. We don't know how long she had him, but it probably wasn't much more than a few years. Just long enough so that he'd be able to be independent and be able to go to Pharaoh's court. However long that was, few years, it's very clear that Jochebed did not let that time go to waste. She was very busy during that time teaching this little boy who he really was, who the Hebrews were. She was teaching him about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the promise of God that they would leave Egypt. And she was teaching him and instilling in him an example of the faith that she had in her God. I mean, it's amazing because they didn't even have scriptures back then. Moses would be the one to write the first scriptures, so those stories had been passed down by generation to generation. And now she was taking her turn to pass down the story of faith and the stories of God to her little guy. What's amazing is when we fast forward and go back into Hebrews, we really realize is that this few years instilled in Moses such a deep faith or understanding of who he really was, that he is actually, if you look at it, a very close model of Jesus Christ, like a foreshadowing of who Jesus Christ is and how he lived and what he did, very much patterned Jesus Christ when he brought the gospel. So then Moses goes to Pharaoh's court, and he spends the next many years of his life being raised as a full-fledged Egyptian. He would have, being the son of Pharaoh, essentially, he was heir apparent to the throne of Egypt. He would have been taught in the greatest schools of Egypt. He would have learned to read and write and all these things, but he also would have learned all about their gods and all about magic and astrology and downright pagan heathenism. That was part of that Egyptian culture, and he was raised up in that. Very likely he was trained in war. He could have very well also even been the general of the Egyptian army, being the son of the king. So he also was trained, in royalty and how to conduct himself as a high-ranking official of the Egyptian court. So a bunch of time passed, and if we read, I think it was in Stephen's sermon, he talked about 40 years. So Moses was around 40 years when we hear what happens to him. So he spends the next almost 40 years of his life as an Egyptian. So you could pretty much say he was pretty well set in his ways. He was a very seasoned man. And yet we're about to see the example of how he didn't forget who he was. The Bible puts a lot of stock in emphasis in how important it is to raise up children, to fear God, to obey him, and to believe in the truth. Proverbs 22:6 says, "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it." Interestingly, Moses himself would later write in Deuteronomy 4:9, he would write about the importance of teaching the next generation. "Only take heed to thyself, and keep thy soul diligently, lest thou forget the things which thine eyes have seen, and lest they depart from thy heart all the days of thy life. But teach them to thy sons and thy sons' sons." So he was encouraging his people, commanding the people, you need to tell your children about the miracles of Egypt, how God delivered us from Egypt through the Red Sea and the plagues and the feeding in the desert. And he knew how important it was to teach the next generation while they were young about faith in God and who God was. So now we get to see Moses as he's grown up. Now he's 40 years old. The next verse, Exodus 2:11 says, "And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown," so we know he's about 40, "and he went out unto his brethren and looked on their burdens. And he spied an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, one of his brethren. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand." So he knew who he was. He was an Egyptian by training, but he really knew that he was a Hebrew. And so when he saw a situation where the Hebrew person was being beaten by the Egyptian, he took the side of his people, the Hebrews. And the ease with which he killed this man, I think, also points to he very likely had some military training. But then the next thing, he says, when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together. And he said unto them that did the wrong, Wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? And he said, Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killest the Egyptian? And Moses feared and said, Surely this thing is known. So Moses goes out again, and now he sees 2 Hebrews fighting. And this, I think, now points to not only did he know who his people were, but he also knew what was right and what was wrong. His mother had taught him what was right, what was wrong, what pleased God and what didn't. And so here he stands up for the one who did what was right, and he goes to the one who did what was wrong. Hey, what are you doing? You shouldn't be doing this. And I think it shows the leadership that he had and that faith that was instilled in him, and to understand how to discern good and evil. Obviously now that he realized that people found out that he had killed an Egyptian, now he was in trouble. So now he had turned on the Egyptians. That was very clear. And so then he ends up having to go into the desert for a while. But yeah, we see that he was not afraid to try to resolve conflicts, to stand up for his people and to stand up for what was right. So now we go back to Hebrews chapter 11, talking about Moses and what he did and why his characteristics as a man of faith. It says, by faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. The important thing is by faith. Every verse that we read is preceded with by faith. Everything that he did, everything that made him great was by faith. What is faith? Faith is believing in that something will happen. And actually the first verse of chapter 11 says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. So when we hope that something will happen, that's because of faith, and we have the faith and believe that this will come to pass. What did Moses have faith in? He had faith in God. He had faith in the promises of God, that he would lead them out of Egypt. He believed that the children of Abraham were God's chosen people. He believed in the Messiah. He knew that a Redeemer was coming to redeem the people. I'm sure he didn't really realize that he would be the one to do the first deliverance out of Egypt, but he had faith in God that God was sending the true deliverer. It says, choosing rather to suffer the affliction of God with the people of God, to suffer the affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. And so now we're starting to see these aspects of Christ coming through. So in the verse we just read, it says that he was going to be the leader of the people like Jesus was. As Moses led the people of Israel out of the bondage of slavery in Egypt, Jesus was the one who's going to lead us out of the bondage of sin and into freedom in heaven. It says, choosing rather to suffer the affliction with the people of God. So Christ did the very same thing. So as Moses decided to be counted with the Hebrews, he turned his back on Egypt and the king's court and decided to take the side of the slaves. And he decided to be one of them. Jesus, the same thing. He left the splendors of heaven, the glory and majesty seated on the right hand of the Father, and he left that to be numbered with men on earth. As Christ was willing to suffer and to live and to die as a man, Moses did the same thing in his pattern, where he was willing to suffer the reproach of the Hebrews and to be treated as a slave. So we see a lot of parallels with how Moses lived his life were very much the attributes of Jesus Christ. Esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than treasures of Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. Moses had faith that being free in the promised land that was promised to the Israelites, that was way better than being an official in Pharaoh's court. He would rather be a free man serving God than to be in great riches and pleasures serving the king of Egypt. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. So Moses turned his back on Egypt, said goodbye to the king of Egypt, and he endured in the promise of God. He didn't see God yet. He would see part of God later, but he had faith in God that these millions of people were going to be freed. And Jesus, same thing. He grew up as a man, yet he renounced the sins of men. He did not commit any sins that we fall prey to. The pleasures of this world that we seem to so much enjoy, Jesus was willing to not do any of that. He lived that perfect life, and he was not afraid of what men were going to do to him because of it. And I think this is amazing. In verse 28, through faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. So Moses himself brings the instructions of the Passover. He instructs them, and he himself partakes in making that sacrifice and marking the doors so that they would be saved from the angel of death that was coming to punish Egypt. The Hebrews were marking themselves as being with God, and they were being saved from the death that was coming to Egypt. And Moses delivered this unto them. And in like manner, Christ would be the one who would deliver the gospel of salvation, except that he takes it way further and makes himself that sacrifice, and now frees all of those who believe in him from the sting of death. So we can see that Moses was a great leader. He was not afraid to stand up for what was right. And when God sent him back when the time was right to go lead the children out of Egypt, he went and he did what God commanded him. He went and withstood Pharaoh to the face and commanded, "You have to let my people go." He was standing up for God. He was standing up for what was right. But it all started with that faith that his mother had in trying to save his life and then teaching him who God was. Otherwise, he would have grown up as an Egyptian and never would have come back to the Hebrews. If she hadn't done that, he would have become an Egyptian and probably one day would have ruled over Egypt, and who knows if he would have even realized he was a Hebrew. If we fast forward to the end of this, or near the end of this chapter, it's kind of like a summary, because there's a lot in this chapter of faith, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and so on. But I find that this is pretty interesting. In verses 32 to 34, it says, "What shall I say more? What shall I more say? For the time would fail me to tell of Gideon, and of Barak, and of Samson, and of Jephthah, and of David also, and Samuel, and of the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens." I mean, this is just fantastic, like what the people of God through faith were able to achieve. And yet in the middle of this huge list, the parents of Moses deserved a worthy mention. So I think we can't just gloss over that fact that it was because of the faith that they had and the love that that mother had for her little boy that caused him to follow God and become one of the greatest leaders Israel ever had. The power and influence of a mother cannot be underestimated. You know, God has given mothers and fathers a very precious few years to instill in their children the truth, the understanding of what is right, what is holy. Many a mother has spent many an hour in prayer for her children, and God has blessed those prayers, and those children have grown up to be God-fearing men and women, to be leaders. And God takes special interest in the passing on of the truth to the next generation. He instituted the family. He's the one who designed the marriage relationship that would then bring forth children that would grow up to be the next generation of his kingdom on earth. Every decision you make as a parent can profoundly influence your children. So one thing we take, I mean, even just for me, I was, thinking about it, and it's like, she made that decision to put him in the basket. And it was a decision by faith. And the profound influence that that decision had on Moses' life, and how that turned the course of history, and how the Pharaoh's daughter was there to see him and bring him back and all of that, but then she was given the opportunity to raise him. As parents, every decision we make needs to be a decision of faith, because the decisions that they make, especially the mothers, who are so close to their little ones, and they see every aspect of them, all of that profoundly influences the next generation. So I'd like to close with a few verses in Proverbs chapter 31. It talks about, we hear about the Proverbs 31 woman, but it's talking about the virtuous woman. And it applies to, all women in general, single, married, and even those with children. But I think that when you're applying all of that to mothers, there's a certain additional level of depth that you can glean from these verses. But in Proverbs 31, verse 10, it says, "Who can find a virtuous woman? For her price is far above rubies." And then if we go down to verse 26, it says, "She openeth her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness. She looketh well to the ways of her household, and eateth not the bread of idleness. Her children arise and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praiseth her. Many daughters have done virtuously, but thou excellest them all. Favor is deceitful, beauty is vain, but a woman, especially a mother, that feareth the Lord, she shall be praised." Amen.